one thing that I think it's important to point out to our students is that predestination is a biblical doctrine. Suck it up. Like it or not, it's in Scripture. Right. It's a deeply scriptural concept. And so when we get to that conversation, which particularly when we always leave it to Calvin. And when we get there in Calvin, roll up your sleeves, here we go. But when we get there, the one thing that's out of bounds is someone saying, well, I don't believe in predestination. I don't like predestination. Right. Predestination, it's okay for you not to like it, but you just need to recognize that you're resisting Scripture right then. Right. Now, that said, what predestination means, what it entails, who's right, who's wrong on it, that is an absolutely open question. Sure. Yeah. Janelle, I know that you've recently been working on teaching Calvin on predestination. Can you give us just a quick sketch of what he teaches about predestination?
Yeah, so for Calvin, the question is a question of God's will, as well as a question of what it is that human beings in our sinful state are actually capable of. So I actually think that one of the greatest entries into Calvin's understanding of predestination is to think about the need for radical grace because of how fallen human beings are, right? So we are just not the kind of creatures who can pull ourselves out by our own bootstraps and get to the point where we can be saved without God's intervention, without God's will becoming involved in bringing us to salvation. I think that's the core of the doctrine, which is why Calvin keeps going back to this doctrine is about humility over and over and over again. He's constantly reminding his reader that what he's telling them about is how humble they need to be in the face of a God who has chosen them for no reason, not for any good that they've done, not for any merit that they've shown, purely because he has willed it, because we just don't have anything to offer.
That's really helpful, because I mean, people will complain about Calvin's arbitrary God, and to them it means something like, well, there's no good reason that he chose this person over that person, and in one sense I can see how that sounds objectionable. In another sense, I think, well, I mean, there's a gratuity to that kind of a grace that I think you're right. I think Calvin really gets the sense that there is nothing that qualifies me. Frankly, not even the fact that I know I'm not qualified. I mean, you can sort of go into the rabbit hole with that. But nothing that qualifies me at all. And he seems to grasp that particularly well. The other things you want to add, I mean, there's the double predestinarian sense too. Can you
so that's the thing that gets really hard, because for Calvin, it's not as though God has this sort of strong will towards salvation and then just forgets about everybody else, or doesn't will anything with respect to everyone else. He's actually willing with respect to the whole population, which means that as much as he's willing some for salvation, he's willing others for damnation, and that's an incredibly difficult doctrine to talk about and to teach. When I teach predestination, we do a little debate, and what I do is I have the two sides go at it for a little while, and then I make them switch.
That's really nice.
So they notice the scriptural pros and cons, and the implications, the great implications on the one side, and the really terrifying implications on the other to Calvin's version of predestination.
I mean, you mentioned the scriptural part, and I think it's important to point out too that, I mean, we read all the theologians charitably and assume that they thought they were being biblical and interpreting the text faithfully. And I think that's true of Calvin. I think certainly, and one of the interesting things about the double predestination is you do have to get your head around the fact that, wow, there's the passages that talk about he desires all people to come to salvation. So he could have willed a universalism. I mean, he could have done that, and I think that's hence the arbitrary God. I mean, there's a point where I think students say, but Paul says that this is true about God. He desires, but yet Calvin is still saying maybe he doesn't desire enough. And of course, lurking around the corner is always that fallenness, Calvin's thoughts on depravity. And so I think it's important, to point out, even for our students, and just when thinking about Calvin, that is something that we also have to consider too, is to think about the ways in which Calvin was aware of those texts, but still knew or sensed or was convicted by the fact that not everyone is going to be saved.
Why do you suppose, let's take it for granted for a second that Calvin doesn't think God's naturally just kind of a meanie. I mean, that's a lot of time people are like, Calvin's God is deplorable and mean and horrible, and that's certainly not how Calvin would have thought of it. Now, even if that were true, I mean, even if that is true, Calvin's not thinking of God as a jerk.
Exactly.
And he certainly thinks of him as the kind of God who can will the salvation of all. What he wants to do is emphasize the the absolute efficacy of the divine will. Yeah. Furthermore, he's convinced that God is not a little bit happy and a little bit sad, or that he's not schizophrenic. He is omnibenevolent. Yeah. And yet he believes in double predestination. And I'm sorry, one more thing. He doesn't think that there's anything in us that qualifies this. I mean, that goes back to your original point. Yeah. Right. So we can't blame the damnation of the reprobate in Calvin. We can't blame it on God's foreknowledge, because he always rules that out. We can't blame it on God being schizoid, because he always rules that out. Right. So what in Calvin would motivate him? Again, there's some exegetical things going on, but what about his account of who God is would motivate him to see this election of reprobation? Right.
Well, there's going to be, there's always a conversation about justice here, right? And this is something that I actually think our generation especially has a difficult time with, is the idea that punishment is ever just, which just isn't the case for people living in the 1600s in France or Germany. And so for Calvin, the idea that those who deserve punishment are punished is going to be not morally difficult to wrap your mind around. The question about how people can deserve punishment if we're as incapacitated as Calvin thinks we are, I actually think is a difficult question. I have a hard time wrestling with that one.
And behind that too, he starts the Institutes with saying that God is infinitely knowable and can be known. And so we can know God, and also through it too is love. I mean, it's justice, but there's also a discussion of love. So there's a sense of where out of God's justice there's punishment, but out of his love there's salvation for some. And I think there's just a mistaken notion that somehow love equals, well, then he should have mercy on everyone and all should be predestined to salvation. Right. I think that's just a false understanding of love, and I think it's not a scriptural understanding of love either. Right. Because God in love punishes.
Even someone like Karl Barth, who some claim is a universalist, he always dogmatically resisted universalism, even though the logic of his theology seemed to move in that direction. And I take that seriously, but it's true that the logic seems to move in that direction for Barth. But what's interesting about Barth is he doesn't think that God puts away his judgment. He just thinks that God concentrates it in the person of the Son. I was about to say on the Son. That's not quite right, because what Barth insists is that Jesus, the incarnate Word, is both the judge and the one who receives the judgment of God. He's the judge in our place, as Barth would say. So it's interesting, even in that extreme example, you don't lose judgment. Right. The question is whether it's theologically and biblically appropriate to say that judgment can be exhausted in the one person, Jesus. Now, the gospel seems to want to say that God does show his judgment in the crucifixion of the Son. Sure. Yeah. And then the question is, for someone like Calvin, is it also necessary to speak of judgment in the damnation of the reprobate?
I wonder if he's just following tradition and doctrine there, just in terms of, it's hard to read Revelation where no one gets judged and no one gets punished except for the Son, right? Yeah. It actually really seems like Scripture is making it clear that there's going to be a separation. So with Calvin's framework in mind, with his sort of ultimate depravity of all human beings and God's will being as sovereign as he wants it to be, I don't think there's an option for Calvin other than to conclude that God has to be willing the damnation of those who aren't elect.
That's a great point about Revelation in terms of the biblical evidence. I don't think we think of that as we go to Romans 9 through 11. We go a few places like that. Yeah.
Well, even Old Testament will demonstrate that although an animal sacrifice carries the weight of the sins and bears the burden of that, if you will, and even sent off into the wilderness, there's still punishment. I mean, God's fairly consistent in punishing his people for their disobedience. So there's both salvation on this one sacrifice, but there's clearly a sense of that justice is still served in some sense through God's acts of punishment.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know we got that sorted.
The Torrey Honors Institute at Biola University. Biblically centered, great books, liberal education. More at biola.edu/Torrey.